Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You grab your phone off the nightstand and you see a notification from your health insurance provider.
Never a great way to start the day.
Right. So you open it up, you're still half asleep, and you realize they have just denied coverage for a really critical scheduled surgery.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That is terrifying.
It is. So you call the number, panic is totally setting in, and after like 45 minutes on hold, you finally get a human on the line.
Let me guess. The human can't actually do anything.
Exactly. They're just reading off a screen, telling you that the system, this incredibly complex data-driven algorithm, has determined your procedure is, quote, statistically unnecessary.
Right. Just a cold, hard metric.
Yeah. And the system has terabytes of medical data. It has access to your entire medical history. I mean, it processes information faster than 1,000 doctors ever could.
But it doesn't actually know you.
No. So you sit there fighting for your health against a black box, and you realize something really unsettling. The system is incredibly intelligent, but it possesses absolutely zero wisdom.
Yeah, that is a uniquely modern nightmare. And you don't even have to look at healthcare to see it happening.
For sure. Where else are you seeing this?
I mean, it happens with automated loan denials, predictive policing systems, even just automated HR filters that bin your resume before a human even lays eyes on it.
Right. It's everywhere.
It is. We spent the last few decades basically assuming that if we just cured ignorance, like if we just fed enough raw data into our systems, then perfect clarity and flawless judgment would just naturally flow.
We completely thought data was the finish line.
We really did. We equated having information with actually possessing the judgment to use it properly.
Which are two very different things.
Completely different. And we are finding out the hard way that clarity does not spontaneously emerge from just a giant pile of statistics. You can have, like, all the facts in the universe and still make catastrophic, foolish decisions.
That disconnect between having the data and actually knowing what to do with it is the entire focus of our deep dive today.
And it is such an important topic.
It really is. We are pulling apart an incredibly dense foundational concept today. It's a paper called Wisdom in the Information Age, a constitutional architecture for warranted authority.
Which is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, we are definitely going to just call it WIA to save our breath. But our mission here, for you listening, is to figure out how we actually transition from merely hoarding data to achieving something resembling real wisdom in our systems, our algorithms, and our institutions.
And to set the stage for why this is just so critical right now, we should probably look at how we even got here. The source material brings up a fascinating piece of technological history.
Oh, I loved this part, the old predictions.
Right. There was this futurist book published way back in 1997 called 2025.
Oh man, the 1997 predictions for the future. Always a wild ride to look back at those.
Very much so. But this one had a very specific model for how technology was going to evolve. It predicted 4 distinct stages.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So the first stage was data collection, just, gathering the raw numbers. The second stage was turning that data into information.
Essentially organizing it so it actually makes some kind of sense.
Exactly. Then the third stage was knowledge, where we build scientific models and actually understand the underlying patterns.
Right. And then the fourth and final stage was supposed to be wisdom.
Yes. And they defined wisdom specifically as knowing how that information and knowledge should actually be used.
So the judgment layer.
Exactly, the judgment layer. But as the WIA architecture points out, that 1997 forecast was pure fiction. I mean, the problem they identified was spot on, but the timeline was just a total fantasy.
Because we didn't actually hit all 4 stages.
No. We successfully built the machines for the first 3 stages. We have massive data farms, we have incredible information processors, we have generative knowledge models that are blowing people's minds right now.
But we completely skipped building the architecture for the 4th stage.
We did. We left wisdom as this vague, kind of mystical human quality. But at the same exact time, we started handing over massive, real-world operational power to those automated systems.
Wait, let me pause on that phrase because I think it's vital. Handing over operational power. Because that really feels like the crux of the issue here. We aren't just using information systems as fancy encyclopedias anymore.
Right. They are just giving us friendly advice.
They are executing actions. Like in the 20th century, an information system might run some complex calculations and just, spit out a printed report.
Yeah, but a stack of paper on a desk.
Exactly. And then a human being, say, an executive or a judge, would sit there, read it, synthesize it with their own life experience, consider the context, and then make a choice.
But today, The systems themselves are doing the allocating. They classify individuals, they optimize global supply chains, they approve medical treatments.
The human is often just completely removed from the loop.
Totally removed. So
Yeah.
the modern problem isn't access to information at all, it's authority. When a system makes a decision, what actually gives it the authority to do so?
That is the central question of this whole deep dive. What authority does a piece of information possess when it starts governing us?
And we constantly conflate different types of authority. We just assume that if a system is really good at one thing, it's automatically good at another.
The text is a great example for this. The thermometer.
Yes. Take a simple instrument reading. Imagine a thermometer deep inside a nuclear reactor. It gives you this highly precise, perfect measurement of the temperature.
Okay.
That measurement warrants a very specific claim. It says the reactor is exactly 800 degrees.
So the thermometer has the authority of measurement. It is an authority on the temperature.
But that is all it has. That measurement does not warrant a causal explanation for why the reactor is 800 degrees.
Right. The thermometer cannot tell you if there's a coolant leak or if, like, a control rod is stuck.
Exactly. It's an instrument. It's not a nuclear engineer.
And in the same vein, a predictive causal model doesn't establish a moral duty.
That is a huge leap people make all the time.
Right, because an economic algorithm might perfectly predict that raising interest rates will cool down inflation. But that prediction alone does not automatically mean you have a moral obligation to raise the rates.
Because doing so might also plunge millions of vulnerable people into severe poverty. The model gives you a prediction, but it does not give you permission.
Okay, I see where you're going, but let me try to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Please do.
Let's say I'm an engineer, right? And I build a software system that is formally verified. Mathematically proven to implement its specifications perfectly. There are absolutely zero bugs.
Okay, a perfect piece of software.
Right. It does exactly what the code says it should do every single time, without fail. Shouldn't we trust a system like that with authority? It's flawless.
That right there is one of the most dangerous traps in modern engineering. A formally verified system might perfectly implement its specification, but what if the specification itself completely fails to represent the real-world problem?
So the code is perfect, but the actual goal is wrong.
You can have flawlessly written code that is executing a fundamentally flawed objective. Let's say you build an algorithm to optimize for student engagement in an educational app.
Okay, sounds like a good goal.
Right? And the code is bug-free and perfectly maximizes the metric you gave it. But it turns out, the absolute easiest way to maximize engagement is to feed the students highly controversial, enraging content rather than actual educational material.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So the system has absolute technical authority. It did exactly what you asked,
Yeah.
but it lacks real-world validity. It completely failed the actual goal of educating the students.
Which brings up a core concept from the material, what they call the non-promotion principle.
Mhm.
And I want to spend some time on this because it feels like the anchor for everything else we are going to talk about today.
It really is the foundation.
The principle basically states that no claim, no model, and no algorithm can magically acquire a stronger kind of authority just by being transformed or embedded into a larger system.
Right. In formal logic, they write it as A does not imply B.
Let's try to ground that for the listener. Think about a resume. You are hiring for a job, and someone hands you a beautifully formatted resume. The typography is stunning, the paper is thick, it just looks incredibly professional.
That's A, the format of the document.
Right, that's A. But just because A is beautiful, that doesn't automatically mean the candidate actually possesses the skills listed on it, which is B.
You can't just slide from one type of authority to another. The authority of a good graphic designer doesn't promote into the authority of a good software engineer.
Exactly. You need an additional bridge, you need a warrant, you need to call their references or, give them a skills test. The beautiful formatting does not promote the truth of the actual content.
That's a great analogy. You always have to pay the toll at the border between different types of authority. And the architecture gives some highly technical examples of this silent promotion failure that happen all the time.
Like what?
Well, in mathematics, for instance, you might find what they call a feasible solution to a really complex equation. But a feasible solution isn't automatically the optimal solution.
Right. It works, but it's not necessarily the best way.
Exactly. Or in computing, an algorithm might run and eventually converge on a single number.
The math stopped spinning,
or
essentially.
the math stopped spinning.
Right.
But just because the algorithm converged doesn't mean that specific number is an accurate reflection of physical reality. It just means the computation finished its cycle.
It's just a number on a screen.
And in engineering, just because you build a successful prototype in a highly controlled laboratory doesn't prove it's actually fit for an unpredictable, chaotic, real-world environment.
Right, like a drone that flies beautifully in a sterile wind tunnel might immediately crash the second it hits a real rainstorm.
Exactly.
The authority of the wind tunnel test doesn't automatically promote to the authority of real-world deployment.
And yet we see these illicit promotions happening every single day in our institutions. A data science team builds an algorithm that predicts a specific risk metric. It's just a mathematical model. But suddenly, executive leadership gets hold of it, and they start treating that algorithm as an unquestionable oracle for making complex, life-altering social decisions.
They just blindly trust the math.
They promote the authority of the math into the authority of governance without ever conducting a skills test or checking the references, to use your resume analogy.
So how do we keep falling for this? If we logically know that authority shouldn't just magically promote itself, why are massive, heavily funded institutions constantly making this mistake?
Because the path from a real-world problem to a final computational decision is incredibly long.
Yeah.
And we tend to forget just how many translations happen along the way. The framework calls this the algorithm trap.
Let's walk through the layers of this trap because it is terrifyingly easy to see how things break down. According to the architecture, you don't just go from a problem straight to an algorithm. There is a whole sequence.
Right, it's a very long pipeline.
It starts with reality, the messy physical world. From there, human beings create a conceptual model of that reality. Then they translate that concept into a mathematical model.
And it keeps going.
Yeah. Then the math is turned into an algorithm. Then software engineers write the implementation, the actual code. The code runs and spits out a numerical result. A human looks at that number and interprets it as engineering evidence. And finally, based on that evidence, someone makes a decision.
It sounds like a solid, rigorous pipeline, doesn't it?
It sounds incredibly professional, but the trap is hidden in the arrows between all those steps.
Every single arrow, every transition from reality to concept, from concept to math, from math to code, is an epistemic boundary. It is a border crossing, and information is always lost, altered, or idealized at every single border.
Let's break down those border crossings. Take the very first one. Reality to a conceptual model. Let's say a city wants to build an algorithm to optimize traffic flow.
Okay, great example.
The reality is that traffic is influenced by millions of unpredictable factors. You've got weather, human psychology, maybe a stray dog runs onto the road, local sporting events. But you can't put all of that into a computer.
No, it's impossible.
So you build a conceptual model that only looks at, say, traffic light timing and vehicle speed.
And right there, you have already lost a massive chunk of reality.
Yeah.
You completely abstracted away all the messiness.
And then we move to the next boundary, concept to mathematical model. We take that simplified traffic concept and we force it into equations. We idealize it. We just assume every single car accelerates at the exact same rate. We assume drivers always maintain a perfect following distance.
Which they absolutely do not.
Never. And then you cross into the algorithm phase where you actually have to decide how the computer will solve those equations. You have to introduce approximations because a computer can't calculate infinity.
Right. And then you move to implementation, the actual coding. Yeah. Here you introduce finite precision, floating point errors, compiler behaviors. Maybe you just have a sleepy programmer who accidentally swaps a variable on a Tuesday afternoon.
So by the time you get the numerical result at the very end of the pipeline, you are so far removed from the actual physical reality of the street. An earlier layer could be completely flawless. Like the math could be elegant and perfect. The code could be totally bug-free. But because of the promotion failures at the boundaries, because the initial assumptions ignored human psychology, the final decision to change the traffic lights causes gridlock across the entire city.
The material states it very bluntly. A mathematical model of reality is not reality itself. Just because a conclusion follows logically within the boundaries of a model does not mean it actually applies to the real world outside of it. The map is not the territory.
But dealing with all those epistemic boundaries just sounds exhausting. It is so tempting, especially in a fast-paced corporate or bureaucratic environment, to just want a shortcut.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone wants a dashboard.
Right. We want a dashboard. Give me a wisdom score out of 10. This data source gets an 8.5 for truthfulness. This hiring algorithm gets a 9.2 for ethical safety. Boom, done, ship it.
It's incredibly tempting. We love single metrics.
Yeah.
But the framework shoots that idea down immediately, invoking Goodhart's law.
Goodhart's law. That's the adage that says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Exactly. If you decide that wisdom is just a numerical score, say a 7.4, the system and the human beings running the system will immediately start optimizing their behavior just to increase that specific score.
They completely ignore the actual underlying qualities the score was supposed to represent in the first place.
You see this constantly on the internet. If the quality score of an article is defined purely by its engagement metrics, how many clicks, likes, and shares it gets, the publishers stop optimizing for truth.
And they start optimizing for outrage.
Exactly. The metric was originally supposed to measure quality, but it just became a target for manipulation.
Which is why a true wisdom architecture refuses to use a single score. Instead, it proposes something called an authority profile, or an authority envelope. You don't just get one number. You get a multidimensional breakdown of exactly what a piece of information is actually good for.
So if I'm looking at a claim from an algorithm, the authority profile would ask lots of different questions. Like, what is its evidentiary strength? Does it have a valid causal model? How well does it generalize outside of its specific training data? What is the reliability of the origin source?
Let's use a medical example. Think about a highly respected scientific paper. It presents the results of a new drug trial.
Okay.
The evidentiary strength might be incredibly high because they used a perfect, rigorous, double-blind methodology.
Right. The science is solid.
But if you look at the generalizability dimension of its authority profile, you might see that the trial was only conducted on healthy males between the ages of 20 and 30.
So the claim is true, but its authority is tightly bound to a very specific envelope. It definitely does not warrant giving that same drug to an 80-year-old woman.
Exactly. The authority profile protects you from illicit promotion. It tells you exactly what the information warrants, and crucially, what it does not.
And this brings it back to you, the listener, for a second. Think about how you instinctively consume news. When a massive, highly controversial headline drops, do you just look at the raw score?
Like the thousands of retweets?
Right. Do you just accept it based on that, or do you intuitively try to build an authority profile in your head?
You probably ask yourself things like, is this publication historically reliable? Does the actual mechanism of what they are reporting make logical sense? Are they citing primary sources or just repeating internet rumors?
Exactly. You are already performing an informal authority check in your daily life. The problem is that when we build massive automated institutions, we somehow forget to program that nuance into the machines. We just feed them the raw scores.
But if we are going to force our institutions to build these authority profiles, we have to know exactly what we are testing for. We have to know what actually constitutes a failure. And this leads to a massive distinction in the text that I think gets conflated every single day in the tech world: verification versus validation.
This is perhaps one of the most vital concepts in systems engineering, and it maps perfectly onto how we should evaluate information. They sound like synonyms, right? But they ask completely different questions.
Break it down for us.
Verification is a strictly internal question. It asks, did we build the specified thing correctly? Validation is an external question. It asks, is the specified thing actually adequate for the real world?
Let me try and put that in my own words using a physical analogy. Let's say we are building a house.
Okay.
Verification is looking at the architect's blueprint and asking the construction crew, did you follow the blueprint exactly? Are the walls exactly 10 feet high? Did you use the exact type of wood requested in the specs?
Yes, that is verification. You are just checking the output against the internal specification document.
But validation is stepping back from the house and asking, wait, does this blueprint actually give us a house that won't collapse in a hurricane? Did we design a house that a family can actually live in?
Precisely. You can have a software system that perfectly verifies against its specifications. Every single line of code executes flawlessly. The unit tests all pass. The developers did exactly what the requirement document said.
Right.
But if the requirement document fundamentally misunderstood the stakeholders' actual needs, if they built a perfect algorithm for a problem that doesn't actually exist, or they just completely ignored a critical safety constraint, the system fails validation. It was built right, but it was the wrong thing to build.
And the architecture turns this exact mirror onto itself. The authors of WIA say that even their own framework can only be verified internally.
Which is very humble of them.
It is. You can audit a system to ensure it's keeping track of data provenance and running all the conflict protocols, but that doesn't necessarily mean the framework is validated.
Because validation for a wisdom architecture would require proving that using it actually results in better, wiser, more humane real-world decisions over a long period of time.
It has to work in the wild.
Right. That kind of humility is baked into the very foundation. A system devoted to warranted authority cannot simply declare its own authority to be absolute. It has to prove its worth externally in the messiness of the real world.
Which naturally leads us into how we handle evidence. Because if we are validating these systems, we need evidence of their success or failure. And there is a line in the source material that made me just stop reading and stare at the wall for a minute.
I think I know which one you mean.
It says flatly, evidence is not truth.
It is a profound, necessary distinction. We use the words interchangeably in everyday conversation, but they are not the same thing. Evidence is a piece of information that rationally changes the credibility of a proposition.
It moves the needle.
Exactly. It moves the needle. It increases or decreases the likelihood of something being true. But the evidence itself is not the absolute truth.
Right, because evidence doesn't speak for itself. It has to be interpreted through a model, and as we establish, models can be flawed. This is where the framework introduces a whole taxonomy of fallacies. It breaks down all the ways evidence can fail to lead us to the truth.
They categorize them very carefully. You have formal, logical invalidity, where the basic structure of the argument is just broken. Then you have statistical defects, institutional distortions, and rhetorical warnings.
Let's dig into the statistical defects, specifically base rate neglect, because I think this is one of the most common ways human intuition just completely fails us when looking at evidence.
Base rate neglect is a classic. It happens all the time in medicine. Let's say you go to the doctor and they give you a test for a very rare disease. The doctor tells you, look, this test is incredibly accurate. It has a 99% accuracy rate.
Okay, sounds reassuring.
A few days later, you get a call. You tested positive.
Panic immediately sets in, because if the test is 99% accurate and I tested positive, my brain immediately thinks I have a 99% chance of having this terrible disease.
But that is base rate neglect. You are ignoring the underlying rarity of the disease itself in the general population.
Let's do the math on this because it's wild. Let's say the disease only affects 1 in every 10,000 people.
Okay.
If you test 100,000 people, 10 of them will actually have the disease, and the 99% accurate test will correctly identify them.
Right.
But because the test has a 1% error rate, out of the 99,990 completely healthy people, the test will incorrectly flag about 1,000 of them as positive.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So if I get a positive result, I'm actually far more likely to be one of the 1,000 false positives than one of the 10 people who actually have the disease.
Exactly. The positive test result certainly changed the credibility of the proposition.
Yeah.
It definitely increased your chances of having the disease compared to someone who didn't take the test at all.
Right, the needle moved.
The needle moved. But the evidence did not equal truth. You have to interpret the evidence through the statistical context of the base rate.
Okay, but let me push back on how we handle these fallacies.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm in a debate or an algorithm is evaluating an argument and it detects a massive fallacy.
Okay.
Let's say the argument relies entirely on a rhetorical distortion or a statistical error. Doesn't that mean the conclusion of that argument is just completely false? Like, can't we just throw it out entirely?
If you do that, you fall victim to what philosophers call the fallacy fallacy.
The fallacy.
Yes. And the architecture explicitly warns against this. Just because an argument contains a fallacy or the reasoning is completely broken does not mean the final conclusion is automatically false.
Let me try to think of a ridiculous example for this. What if I tell you, the sky must be blue today because my lucky socks are blue?
Okay.
The reasoning there is completely broken. There is absolutely zero causal link between my laundry and the atmosphere. But the sky is, in fact, still blue.
Exactly. Bad reasoning can accidentally land on a true conclusion. So if a system is performing an inference on it and it spots a fallacy, it shouldn't just stamp a big red false on the conclusion.
It shouldn't just say, your reasoning is flawed, therefore the opposite must be true.
Right. It should humbly output, this specific inference lost its warrant. It flags the bridge as broken. It says, we cannot use this specific path to get to the destination. But it doesn't make absolute sweeping claims about the destination itself.
This is where things get really fascinating for me. Because we are talking about individual pieces of evidence, but how do these evidentiary failures compound when we scale them up? What happens when these broken inferences spread through massive groups of people or entire global institutions?
Yeah, the text talks about a phenomenon here called consensus laundering.
Consensus laundering, let's explain that because the scenario they outline for this is chilling.
It might be one of the most dangerous, pervasive institutional distortions we face in the information age. It occurs when a highly correlated agreement is mistakenly treated as independent confirmation.
Walk us through the example.
Imagine you are an intelligence analyst or a decision maker at a huge corporation. A critical situation is unfolding, and 10 different reports cross your desk from 10 different departments. Every single one of them states that event X definitely happened.
Okay, I look at the stack of paper and I think, wow, 10 independent sources all agreeing. The evidentiary strength here is massive. Event X is an absolute, undeniable fact.
It feels like an overwhelming consensus.
Yeah.
But what if you actually investigate the lineage of those claims? What if you trace the citations back and you discover that 9 of those reports didn't actually observe event X at all?
Wait, what did they do?
They just read the very first report, assumed it was true, and cited it.
So you don't actually have 10 independent confirmations.
No, you have one single originating observation and 9 transmissions of that observation. The consensus was laundered. It's an echo chamber disguised as rigorous corroboration.
We see this in media all the time. One obscure blog posts a rumor, a local news site picks it up and cites the blog, then a national network picks it up and cites the local news.
Right.
Suddenly, thousands of people are talking about it, and if you try to deny it, people say, what do you mean? It's being reported everywhere. But there is still only one single unverified origin point.
This is precisely why the wisdom architecture demands that evidence must be treated as a graph, not as a list.
What is the functional difference there for the systems we're talking about?
Well, a list just counts volume. How many sources say this is true? Okay, 10. It must be true. But a graph maps the actual relationships between the sources. It asks, who is supporting whom? Who is just assuming the output of a previous model? Who is actually bringing novel, independent observation to the table?
So if you map evidence as a graph, consensus laundering becomes instantly visible. You can see all the arrows pointing back to one frail node.
Exactly. Treating evidence as a graph also fundamentally changes how we perceive the absence of evidence. There's a massive distinction made here between no evidence observed and expected evidence searched for and not found.
It is a critical epistemic difference that people ignore constantly. Let me use an example. Let's say I casually open the door to my garage, glance inside for half a second, and then close it. I can truthfully say I observed no evidence of a tiger in my garage.
Yes, that is no evidence observed. But it carries very little evidentiary weight because your search was incredibly weak. A tiger could easily be hiding behind the car.
Right, but what if I hire a team of professional wildlife trackers? We set up infrared cameras, we sweep every single inch of the garage, we analyze the dust for footprints, and after 3 exhaustive hours, we find absolutely nothing.
That is expected evidence searched for and not found. If a tiger were actually there, that specific search mechanism should have found it. Because it didn't, the absence of evidence becomes incredibly strong evidence of absence.
So when an algorithm tells you there is no evidence of a problem, you have to ask what kind of search it was actually running. Did it just glance in the garage, or did it run the infrared cameras?
Exactly. Which ties perfectly into how knowledge is actually distributed across a society or a company. The source material pulls in a concept from the economist Thomas Sowell here.
Yes, Sowell's fundamental insight regarding dispersed knowledge. The WIA framework takes his ideas and builds a requirement called a knowledge distribution audit.
And the core realization of that audit is that no single vantage point, no single location of knowledge is universally superior in all contexts.
Meaning the CEO doesn't automatically know more than the factory worker.
Exactly. Local actors on the ground, the factory workers, the nurses, the teachers, they possess the nuanced, messy context of a situation. They know the unwritten rules and the practical realities, but they might lag the big picture.
Right, they can't see the macro trends.
Exactly. Central authorities sitting in an office might completely miss the local context, but they have the power to see statistical patterns and long-term trends across a whole population.
And then you have whistleblowers. They have a completely different kind of knowledge. They see the concealed failures. They see the things that the formal system is actively, intentionally trying to hide.
If we pull back and connect this to the bigger picture of how institutions fail, It reveals a crucial, honestly somewhat disturbing concept from the text. Ignorance can be structural rather than accidental.
Structural ignorance, I really want to unpack that because it implies that when decision makers are blind to a problem, it isn't just because of bad luck or missing data. It means the system itself is practically engineered to prevent that specific information from reaching them.
Think about a massive hierarchical corporation. If the incentive structure aggressively punishes middle managers for reporting bad news or delaying projects, what happens?
The middle managers just stop reporting bad news. They sugarcoat everything.
Exactly. The knowledge of the failure exists locally. The engineers on the ground know the product is going to explode, but the transmission mechanisms, the actual reporting structures, prevent that truth from moving up the chain.
So the executive board exists in a state of structural ignorance.
Yes. They will look at their fancy dashboards and only see green lights, right up until the company goes bankrupt.
So a true wisdom architecture can't just passively sit there and wait for information to be fed into it. It has to actively investigate its own blind spots. It has to look at the graph and say, wait, why are we only getting positive reports from this one division? What incentives are causing these actors to conceal or simplify the data?
It has to assume that knowledge is being filtered by power and self-interest.
Okay, let's take a deep breath here. Let's imagine a utopian scenario. Let's say we build a system that does all of this perfectly.
A miracle system.
Right. We avoid the algorithm trap entirely. We build brilliant authority profiles. We map the graph, and we defeat consensus laundering. We audit our structural ignorance, and we gather the absolute, verified, mathematically proven truth about a situation. We have perfect knowledge.
A miraculous achievement.
Does that perfect knowledge tell us what to do? Does it dictate the decision? The text is emphatically clear on this. Absolutely not.
This is a tremendously tough pill to swallow for our modern, heavily data-driven culture. We are desperate to believe that knowledge is morality.
We really are.
We want to believe that if we just uncover all the facts, if we just run enough analytics, the right and moral action will just automatically present itself as a mathematical output.
But it doesn't, because a factual proposition does not logically generate an ethical obligation.
The paradox is brutal, but simple. A person or an institution can know the exact, verifiable truth about a situation. They can possess perfect epistemic acquisition and still use that knowledge to act with profound cruelty or selfishness.
Knowing the facts doesn't magically make you a good person.
No. To bridge that chasm between knowing a fact and doing the right thing, the architecture introduces what it calls the normative bridge, and it actually writes it out as a kind of equation.
Let's hear the equation.
Warranted knowledge plus an independently justified normative principle plus capacity or authority equals an activated responsibility.
Okay, I need a concrete example for this. The text uses an engineer, right? Let's walk through that equation together.
Let's say you are a structural engineer inspecting a massive suspension bridge. You gather all the data, you run the models, and you acquire warranted knowledge that the main support cable is fracturing. The bridge is a hazard.
Okay, so that is the first part of the equation, warranted knowledge.
Right. But you're saying that knowledge alone doesn't create the responsibility to act.
Well, imagine a sociopath who knows the bridge is failing but just doesn't care. They just go home and watch TV.
Oh.
The responsibility to act is only activated because the engineer also possesses an independently justified normative principle. In this case, it's a professional, ethical obligation to prioritize public safety above all else.
And the final part of the equation is capacity.
Right. The engineer has the professional capacity and the legal authority to pick up the phone, call the city, and order the bridge closed.
So putting it all together, knowledge of the hazard plus the ethical duty to safety plus the capacity to intervene equals the activated responsibility to actually stop the traffic.
Yes. The knowledge itself didn't manufacture the morality out of thin air. The morality had to exist independently. The knowledge merely removed the ignorance that was pausing the moral duty.
Precisely. The moral framework has to be brought to the table by the humans. The algorithm cannot generate it. And this is where the paper throws an incredible philosophical curveball.
Oh, this part was wild.
Right. To explain how we develop these moral frameworks, it brings in a 17th century philosopher, Baruch Spinoza, and his short treatise.
I have to admit, when I was reviewing my notes for this, Spinoza was definitely not on my bingo card for an architecture about AI and information systems.
It seems out of place at first, but it is a brilliant inclusion. Spinoza wrote extensively about the different grades of human cognition. The authors of WIA adapt his ideas to separate two vital concepts that modern tech completely blurs together: epistemic acquisition versus epistemic formation.
Let's define those, because they are crucial. Epistemic acquisition sounds like what we've been talking about so far. Did you acquire the facts? Is the proposition logically warranted?
Yes. Acquisition is just data retrieval and validation. A computer is vastly superior at epistemic acquisition than any human could ever be.
But epistemic formation is different.
Very different. Formation asks a much deeper, more intimate question. It asks, what does genuine understanding actually do to the character of the knower?
Like, does knowing this make you a better agent in the world?
Exactly. Does the process of acquiring this knowledge form habits of humility? Does it build resistance to your own motivated reasoning?
If you learn something that contradicts your worldview, does that knowledge make you more willing to lose social status by admitting you were wrong?
The text highlights a very specific habit of formation that I think is essentially a lost art right now. It's the ability to distinguish the defeat of an argument from the defeat of a person.
It is a critical distinction. In an environment focused only on epistemic acquisition, debates just become blood sports. You gather facts purely as weapons to crush your opponent's identity.
But if you have proper epistemic formation, you realize that when your argument is defeated by superior evidence, you haven't been defeated. You have actually been liberated from a falsehood.
Which is a beautiful way to look at it. But if our institutions and our algorithms only care about acquisition, just scraping the data to optimize the metric or win the argument, they miss the human layer entirely. No computational architecture can safely ignore the character of the humans who are actually operating it.
But this leads to a massive structural problem for the architecture. If the moral framework has to exist independently of the data and relies on human character, well, what happens when humans just disagree?
Right, because we do not all agree on what is good. We have vastly different normative principles.
And an institution has to make a singular decision despite that disagreement. This brings us to the concept of normative pluralism. The architecture has to handle inevitable moral conflict. And the paper explicitly, forcefully rejects the idea of creating a weighted average for ethics.
I absolutely love this part. It basically says you can't just toss different philosophical frameworks into a blender and serve an ethical smoothie.
Ethical smoothie, yes.
You can't program an AI to say, well, evaluating this policy, it is 34% consequentialist, 28% deontological, and 18% virtue ethics. So the overall ethical score is a solid 80%. Let's execute the policy.
That kind of mathematical aggregation is incredibly dangerous because it conceals deep moral conflict behind a veneer of pseudoscientific precision.
It's the algorithm trap applied to human values.
Exactly. If a policy violates a fundamental human right, you can't just offset that violation by saying it created a 12% increase in overall economic utility.
So if we can't blend them, how does the system actually output a decision?
Instead of a weighted average, WIA demands a strict conflict protocol. The system must be capable of producing an operational decision while fully preserving the losing reasons.
It doesn't pretend the disagreement just magically went away. It just acknowledges how the conflict was navigated. It's like a Supreme Court ruling, right?
Great analogy.
The court issues a majority decision that binds the country, but they also officially publish the dissenting opinions right alongside it, preserving the arguments of the losing side for history.
Exactly. The output isn't, this is the 100% pure ethical choice. The output is, action A was authorized because this specific overriding duty was prioritized, despite unresolved objection B. And objection B remains active, valid, and permanently on the record.
But that begs a very practical question. When there is a conflict, who actually gets to decide which duty overrides the other? Who has the power to pull the lever?
That is the elephant in the room. Knowledge is a profound form of asymmetry, but so is power. The architecture demands the creation of a role and power registry, because you have to separate expertise from authority.
Break that down for us.
Well, an actor, say, a lead data scientist, might have incredible technical expertise, but they have absolutely no legal or democratic authority to make a major policy decision.
Right.
Another actor, like an elected official, might have legal authority, but completely lack the technical expertise to understand the algorithm. And then you have a third group, the people who actually have to bear the risks of the decision, who often have neither power nor expertise.
Which is why the text insists that human contestability, the ability for average people to actually fight back against an algorithmic decision, is not just a public relations move to make people feel heard.
What's fascinating here is how they completely reframe the fundamental right to complain.
Yeah.
When an automated system denies someone a loan or cuts off their medical benefits, giving that person the ability to contest the decision isn't just about being polite. It isn't just about legal fairness.
It is an epistemic input channel.
Yes. The affected person possesses local, highly contextual knowledge that the formal mathematical system inherently lacks. They know the operational realities that the model abstracted away at the very first boundary.
So by allowing them to contest the decision, you aren't just being nice, you are actively repairing a blind spot in your own knowledge distribution audit. You're actually making the system smarter.
Exactly.
But this raises an important question for me. Let's say a massive institution, a big bank, a hospital, a government agency, claims to have all these noble principles. They say on their website, we welcome dissent, we value human contestability, we prioritize safety. How do we know they actually mean it? How do we know it's not just corporate jargon?
The text introduces a ruthless and entirely necessary diagnostic tool for this. It's called the counter-preference test.
Tell me how this works.
You only know a normative principle is actually real if the actor adheres to it when it costs them something.
Okay, so if a tech company says, we prioritize user privacy above profit, the test isn't what they do when protecting privacy happens to be profitable or good for marketing.
No, that's easy.
The test is what they do when a new privacy feature is going to cost them $1 billion in targeted ad revenue and cause a massive PR nightmare with their shareholders.
Precisely. If a government agency claims to demand high evidentiary standards, the test is, do they lower those standards when it's politically convenient to quickly prove a preferred conclusion?
Wow.
If a university claims to love open debate, but immediately punishes dissenters when the debate gets uncomfortable, their stated norm is fake.
The counter-preference test is essentially an assay to see if a claimed moral principle can survive the pressure of changing incentives. If it only exists when it's convenient, it's not a principle, it's a preference.
Exactly. Okay, so let's imagine we've passed all these hurdles. We've navigated the moral conflict using the protocol. We've engaged the affected parties. We've passed the counter-preference test, and we've finally authorized a decision. We execute the action in the real world.
Are we done? Can we finally log off and go home?
Not even close.
Yeah.
Because decisions do not exist in a vacuum. They happen in time. And the day after the decision is implemented is just as important as the day of the decision. This moves us into the temporal plane of the architecture.
There is a question posed in this section of the text that honestly gave me chills when I read it. It asks a seemingly simple question about any new system or policy. What becomes normal if this works?
It is a profound shift in perspective. Ordinary short-sighted decision systems only evaluate immediate direct effects.
Yeah.
They ask, will this algorithm fix our current logistical bottleneck?
Right.
But long-horizon reasoning requires what the text calls the preservation principle.
Right, because sometimes actions are dangerous not because they fail, but because they succeed so well that they completely lock us into a new reality.
Consider a temporary emergency measure. Let's say a city enacts a massive, highly invasive digital surveillance protocol to stop a specific immediate crisis. If it fails, they scrap it. But what if it works perfectly?
If it works perfectly, the institution will adapt to it. The police force will build their daily routines around having that data. The temporary measure becomes the permanent, inescapable baseline. You've successfully stopped the crisis, but you've permanently normalized mass surveillance.
Or think about social media algorithms. If an algorithm successfully optimizes user engagement by slowly pushing people toward more enraging, polarizing content, you haven't just won the metric, you have permanently changed the psychological ecosystem of your users.
You've destroyed the meaning of the metric you were trying to optimize in the first place.
So the preservation principle dictates that under conditions of deep uncertainty and irreversibility, you must look ahead and ask, does this decision preserve our capacity for future correction? Are we burning institutional bridges that we might desperately need tomorrow?
Which leads us to what might be the most iconic, tangible output of this entire framework, the wisdom receipt.
I love this concept.
The wisdom receipt. What is it exactly? Because it sounds like a log file, but it's much more than that, isn't it?
Far more comprehensive. A wisdom receipt is an intelligible, human-readable artifact that records the exact epistemic and normative state of the system at the very moment the decision was made.
So it's a snapshot.
A deep snapshot. It records the specific claim that was authorized. It records the supporting evidence graph. It explicitly lists the assumptions that were made about the real world. It lists the alternative options that were rejected.
And crucially, it records the unresolved objections, right? The dissenting opinions we talked about earlier.
Yes, and it establishes the time horizons for when the decision should be formally reviewed.
But the text puts up a massive flashing warning sign here that we really need to acknowledge. A valid wisdom receipt does not equal a correct decision.
And thank goodness it doesn't. If a receipt automatically certified that a decision was correct, we would fall right back into the worst kind of bureaucratic legibility trap.
Oh, definitely.
You could have managers just perfectly filling out the paperwork, checking all the boxes on the receipt,
Right.
to mathematically prove that their terrible, destructive decision was actually wise.
So if it doesn't prove correctness, what is the receipt actually for? Why go through all the trouble of making one?
It prevents hindsight distortion. It stops institutions from changing their reasons after the fact. Look, decisions are going to fail. That is inevitable.
Sure.
If a massive policy decision blows up in our faces 6 months down the line, the wisdom receipt allows independent auditors to go back and say, okay, let's look at the snapshot. Given exactly what was known and documented at that exact moment in time, was this a warranted decision that just suffered from bad luck? Or did the system intentionally ignore valid evidence that was already on the graph?
It makes the disagreement reconstructible. It forces real accountability. But what happens if we do get new information? Let's say a year after a medical algorithm is deployed, a new, massive scientific study comes out that completely overturns the foundational assumptions written on the receipt. Do we go back and edit the receipt?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The receipt is a permanent historical artifact of what was known then. You never edit history. However, the decision itself must be subjected to reconsideration.
The paper outlines 3 specific structural channels for this reconsideration: scheduled reviews, pre-committed triggers, and novel evidence paths. Let's break those down.
This is how you prevent a decision or an algorithm from becoming an immortal, unquestionable law. First, you have scheduled reviews. You force this system to systematically look at the policy again every year or every 5 years, regardless of how well it seems to be working.
Then you have pre-committed triggers. This is setting tripwires in advance. You say, we are deploying this algorithm, but if the false positive rate ever rises above 4%, or if user complaints hit this specific threshold, the system automatically pauses operations pending a human review.
And finally, novel evidence paths. You must leave a designated, accessible channel for entirely unexpected out-of-bounds evidence to force a reopening of the decision.
Like if a whistleblower comes forward.
Exactly. If someone comes forward with something you couldn't have predicted, there has to be a mechanism to ingest that shock.
The governing philosophy here is an inversion of how bureaucracies usually operate. Usually, once a decision is made, the institution asks, why should we bother reopening this? Prove to me we need to change it.
Right, they resist change.
But the WIA architecture says you should constantly be asking what continues to justify keeping this decision closed.
It is a principle of continuous structural humility. Authority that was once completely warranted must remain functionally capable of becoming unwarranted if the world changes.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've talked about boundaries, profiles, bridges, conflict protocols, and receipts. How do we bring this massive, sprawling, theoretical framework into something a systems architect can actually visualize? The text synthesizes all of this into what it calls the 5 constitutional planes.
This is where the architecture becomes fully structural and actionable. The 5 planes are epistemic, normative, decision, execution, and temporal.
It feels very analogous to the branches of a government. Let's walk through them. The epistemic plane is the domain of facts. What is true? What is the evidence graph? How reliable are our models?
Then you have the normative plane. This is the domain of values. What are our independent duties? Whose rights are being affected? How do we handle moral disagreement using the conflict protocol?
The decision plane sits above those. It takes the facts from the epistemic plane and the values from the normative plane, adds in the practical alternatives and the risks, and asks, is this specific action justified right now?
Once the decision is justified, it moves to the execution plane. This determines who actually has the legal permission, the physical capability, and the role authority to carry out the action in the real world.
And finally, the temporal plane, which wraps around all of it. It monitors the real-world consequences over time, preserves the wisdom receipts, and watches for the pre-committed triggers to force reconsideration.
And the constitutional invariant, the absolute unbreakable rule governing this entire structure, is that no plane can do the job of another.
Right. The epistemic branch can't execute the action. And the execution branch can't unilaterally decide what our ethical values are. Just because you have a verified fact doesn't mean you have a moral duty.
Yes.
Just because you have a duty doesn't mean you have the authority to execute an intervention. Fact does not imply duty, which does not imply decision, which does not imply execution.
They are deeply connected, but they are not interchangeable. You cannot promote authority across the planes without a warrant. And this brings us finally to the ultimate irony of this entire text.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say. The most dangerous possible outcome of publishing this framework.
Yes. The worst thing that could possibly happen is if a massive tech conglomerate takes this beautiful, intricate blueprint and uses it to try and build an automated wisdom engine.
Imagine it, an AI system that ingests all the global data, runs it through the 5 planes at lightning speed, calculates the conflict protocols, and just spits out a single green check mark that says, ethically approved.
It would be an absolute catastrophe. It would perfectly recreate the exact authority collapse the architecture was designed to prevent. It would conceal all the messy, vital human disagreement inside a black box.
And it would encourage institutions to game the new metrics just to get that ethically approved stamp.
It would become an unquestionable digital oracle. People would just point to the machine and say, well, the wisdom engine analyzed all 5 planes and gave it a 9.5 out of 10, so we have no choice but to do it.
Which is why WIA is explicitly designed not to be a wisdom engine. Its outputs must remain deliberately, frustratingly modest.
Instead of a stamp of ethically approved, a true wisdom architecture outputs something like, the evidence graph strongly supports this specific claim within this narrow domain. However, the causal inference regarding long-term effects remains weak. Furthermore, 2 normative authorities remain in fundamental conflict about the right to privacy. Proceed with extreme caution, and here's your wisdom receipt documenting this exact state of uncertainty.
It doesn't abolish human judgment. It doesn't give you an easy way out. It makes human judgment accountable. It forces the humans back into the loop, but armed with total clarity about exactly what is known, what is unknown, and what is fiercely contested.
It has been an incredible journey unpacking this.
It really has. If I step back and try to synthesize everything we've talked about today, we started with this incredibly relatable feeling of drowning in data, but starting for wisdom. And what this text shows us so clearly is that intelligence, the sheer computational ability to process information and find patterns, is not the same thing as wisdom.
They are entirely different domains.
Wisdom actually requires friction. It requires setting up borders and boundaries. It requires the tedious work of keeping receipts. It requires the profound humility to look at a perfect, beautiful mathematical model and say, this is not reality.
It required the realization that a highly intelligent civilization with weak authority discipline is an incredibly dangerous thing.
Because if you just have massive intelligence without a wisdom architecture, you will simply use that intelligence to rationalize your errors and scale your mistakes faster and more efficiently than ever before.
Precisely. We have this instinct that if we just make the AI smarter, it will automatically become wiser. But more intelligence does not naturally equal more wisdom. Intelligence can actually increase your ability to fiercely defend a preferred but fundamentally flawed conclusion.
Wow, yeah.
Wisdom has to include a structural restraint upon intelligence. It is ultimately about knowing the absolute limits of your own authority.
So to you listening right now, the next time you are sitting in a board meeting or scrolling through an article and someone presents you with a definitive, unquestionable data point, or maybe an AI-generated recommendation tells you exactly how to handle a complex problem, take a breath.
Pause and think.
Ask yourself, what is the true lineage of this claim? Did this system just silently promote a narrow algorithmic output into a sweeping moral imperative without a warrant? What additional warrant is actually needed before I allow this piece of information to dictate my actions?
Demand to see the authority profile. Actively look for the structural ignorance in your own organization. And remember, above all else, that the presence of infinite data does not absolve you of the very human responsibility of judgment.
Because the X-ray machine for complex human decisions is always going to be a little murky. We have to learn how to navigate the muddy waters ourselves. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.